right. Hello. All right. Let us pray. Lord Jesus, we just thank you as always for this glorious day, the gift that you've given us of life and living. And we are just so thankful to gather together in your name to learn more about how to present you and how to share your name and your truth and your beauty in the world. In such a dark world we have right now, let us be light, let us be salt, as we say. We thank you for Jeffrey and all of his wisdom and all of his teachings, and we just pray that we have open hearts and minds to your wisdom and your truth, Lord, and let it be written on our hearts and spoken in the world. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Well, good evening. Good to see you all, and those of you joining us online as well. Very much looking forward to what we'll be talking about this evening. We should be able to finish up the initial outline that we covered most of last week and the previous week. Ought to be able to finish that up fairly promptly, and then we can transition into the main topic for this evening and probably the next couple of weeks, and that is the book C.S. Lewis on politics, government, and the good society. A lot of people, including Christians who have read rather extensively in Lewis's works, don't realize that he actually wrote quite a lot on cultural issues, political issues, and so hopefully it'll be quite an inspiring revelation to those of you who value his thinking and his work so much, as frankly I think we probably all should do. So we'll be covering that. But first I wanted to finish up the last couple of pages of the outline, Christianity and Culture, an introduction. Anything before we get started here? Any questions or comments before we finish up this section? And again, just a reminder, those of you who join us online, oftentimes, of course, I'm concentrating on the material, teaching the material in class here, and oftentimes I'll neglect to check for comments coming in from you all. So anything that you'd like to comment on, question, or otherwise, you can do that using the chat feature. And should I forget to check that, just remind me, and I'll be glad to access it. All right, so in our previous 2 weeks, as I said, we've actually covered quite a lot. We started out talking about how political awareness and cultural awareness really is a significant part of Christian discipleship, and how can we possibly love others as Christ commanded us to do so if we are pretty oblivious and uninterested in the kind of society and culture in which we live, and the laws and regulations that oftentimes either impinge on people's liberties or otherwise, that really do impact the quality of life. And so we talked about that in our first session. We also, on page 2 of your outline, talked about the problem of so-called Christian nationalism, which is popular in some circles of Christianity today. In particular, the new apostolic Reformation movement that's been going on now for virtually 30 years, but for most of us, we've only become aware of it in the last 10 or 15 years or so. And it's this idea that we need to impose biblical standards and principles, including Old Testament principles and standards, on our society. And so we critique that, the fallacy in that view. That's a view that's been held by Christians for a long time. But as I said, it's gained more momentum in the last 15 or 20 years. So we critiqued that issue of so-called Christian nationalism. And the point that I always try to make in that regard is that we want to live in a civil, decent society, and all for the sake of everyone. And there is a foundation for social and cultural morality. It's called natural law, um, probably better understood as natural moral law. And these are standards of behavior and all that we should expect everyone in society to adhere to. Now, as Christians, we're called to a much higher standard. It's for us, our basic challenge is not merely to do no evil to other people, but rather to love others as we should. And so ours is a more proactive agenda, and we need to commit ourselves to that. But nonetheless, those are standards that oftentimes exceed, the awareness and in many cases even the capabilities of non-Christians in society. But natural law principles, the reason we say so much chaos and violence and frankly insanity in our society today is because America, like Western civilization in general, the farther we get from any kind of Christian influences, the more that societal norms will break down. And we see that, of course, every day being played out in the news and so on. And so that's the standard by which we need to be attentive to and insist that our politicians, our governing officials, and so on adhere to those standards. Most of them, or many of them, do not, but we see the consequences. So we talked about that. Also, the fact that America's founding fathers were really trying to establish a constitutional republic here in the United States, not a democracy. And there is a basic difference between the two. We talked about that fundamental difference between what we would call constitutional Republican style government and democracy as it's typically understood. And we finished on our calling as Christians to think and live as true countercultural followers of Jesus Christ, which means if we're serious in our faith and applying our faith to every aspect of life, then we are going to be out of sync with so many people in our society. Last week, we took a brief look at H. Richard Niebuhr and his book that was written in 1951. It got a lot of attention back then. I guess it was to some extent rather influential, called Christ and Culture. And he was talking about various views in which Christians have had through the centuries in terms of how we should look at our society, our culture, the degree of our interaction, and so on. And so we commented on that. But for the most part last week, we focused on pages 3 and following in your notes, quoted quite a bit from the introduction to Chuck Colson and Nancy Pearcey's book, How Now Shall We Live? What they called at the time our great cultural commission. And we're all familiar, of course, with what Jesus called the Great Commission, which was the evangelistic model for how we should express our faith. But Colson and Pearcey say, well, we also have a great cultural commission. And if we don't take that seriously, and don't take it seriously that our faith should apply to how we look at how, for instance, this nation is governed and so on, then it's going to just spiral more and more out of total control. And again, that legacy is very obvious. Now, on page 4, you'll see that I had planned to address this issue, ruminations on aesthetics or art, but for time's sake, I had to skip over that. And I think what I'll do is just send to everybody excerpts from my book, American Crisis, that talk a lot about how art is such an important feature of any society and culture, for better or for worse, and how should Christians assess the arts. And so I'll send that out as a separate short reading. So for tonight, we'll start here on page 5 with the, as you see, graph, the political scale. And the point here is that a political system needs to be structured to accurately account for the realities of human nature. Now, there's 2 extremes that I think as Christians we would want to avoid when it comes to supporting a certain ideology and certain politicians associated with these ideologies. And one extreme that we want to avoid would be libertarianism. Now, the problem with libertarianism, see, is that it's based on the premise that mankind is innately good. And therefore, we need very little government oversight. Now, as you know, that's clearly out of sync with what the Bible talks about, or what the Bible presents in terms of the realities of human nature. We definitely need government. We need rules and laws. Otherwise, a society is going to very quickly descend into chaos and anarchy. And so that's, I think, rather obvious. But a lot of Christians, because they're so concerned with all the left-wing socialist, neo-Marxist, communist trends that we've witnessed throughout our lifetime, many Christians want to embrace the opposite extreme, libertarianism. But libertarianism, again, is totally dependent on the premise, the faulty premise, that human beings are good and decent and fair and just and so on, which just frankly does not comport with reality. Now, the opposite of libertarianism, obviously, would be authoritarianism, or in the modern world, even totalitarianism. And this is that elitist position that only the best and the brightest should wield power, so as to keep the dumb masses of people pacified and compliant. So this authoritarian orientation is the one that all these left-wing ideologies, fascism, Nazism, communism, all various degrees, socialism, and so on, they embrace that. Now, America's founding fathers, remember now, they're crafting a new nation almost 250 years ago, and America back then had much stronger Christian influences than it does today. And so what they crafted was something that in our minds looks more like a almost libertarian style of government. But as time has gone on, we've seen that in fact it doesn't really comport with the realities of human nature. But that was their intention, to grant as much freedom and liberty as possible. Now, that was a very radical concept back in their day. There had never really been a nation founded on those principles, but nonetheless, they emphasized that virtue needed to be integrated into every aspect of American society and culture as well, or else a nation that was founded too much on libertarian principles was going to very quickly fall apart. So they had a pretty realistic understanding of human nature. Anyway, you see the chart there, and what I call political orientations, two models. Now, the one at the top, this linear model, or the standard model, is one that you always see represented in political analysis. And so let's kind of start in the middle there. And according to this model, what we would call liberalism or moderation would be in the center. And then as you move to the left, you move more and more into government control over more areas of life. And that takes us into the realm of socialism. And if you go too far in that direction, it leads to communism, Marxism, and so on. Now, again, going back to the center, if you move to the right, that is supposedly right-wing conservatism. If you keep going to the right, it's libertarianism. And then on the far right, what do we find? Nazism and fascism. And I think it's obvious looking at this chart, at this linear model, it's totally fallacious. Because on one extreme, you have communism, Marxism, and on the other extreme, you have Nazism and fascism. That's supposedly far right, but those two ideologies have far more in common than otherwise. Now, where did we get this idea that communism is left wing, but for instance, Nazism and fascism are right wing? Well, we got that view, that opinion from Lenin and Stalin themselves, who called anything other than Bolshevism, far left-wing neo-Marxism, they called it all right-wing. And so when Hitler, who shares a lot of the same values and political agenda as the communists, except that, as you know, with Nazism, the one difference that stands out so pronouncedly is their overt racism, which wasn't necessarily part of Marxism. But this idea that Nazism is on the far right and communism on the far left, again, that was just, frankly, communist propaganda, Bolshevik propaganda. It doesn't comport with reality at all. Those two ideologies, as I said, have far more in common, and to call them two opposite extremes is just absurd. But that is the model that is usually presented in political science. Dolly, Dan may need a copy of the outline there.
Well, I have a PDF.
Okay. Now, I think a much more realistic understanding of the political spectrum would be the revised two-dimensional model. And you see that this is all about, on the one scale, the Y scale, state control of the economy. How much control over the economy does the government have? And then on the X scale is state control over society and culture in general. And it goes from virtually absolute control to virtually no control whatsoever. So if you were to overlay a map of the United States on this scale, then we'd say that down here in the far southwest, in other words, around San Diego, we have anarchy, okay, which is no government at all. And as we know, that's only a temporary thing. Whenever there's a power vacuum, it's going to be filled. So anarchism is just really tearing down everything that currently exists, but it's not going to last. It's no system of government whatsoever. Now, moving up a little bit, maybe closer to Phoenix, Arizona or something, we have libertarianism. And you see the original US constitutional republic was more or less in that direction as well on the scale. Now moving up to what we might call Oklahoma, we have contemporary conservatism. And contemporary conservatism calls for very limited government control of the economy. Now, when it comes to government control of society and culture, you see that there's quite a span, because conservatives, especially Christian conservatives, typically would want to see government control, strict government control, over things like potent, what used to be illegal drugs, pornography, things like that that are so obviously socially destructive. So contemporary conservatives would like to see more control over those elements. But on the other hand, they want less government control over other aspects of social and cultural life, education, for instance, and so on. Now, moving on up, we have modern liberalism. And you see that it also has a span of thought regarding all these economic, but also social and cultural issues, except that modern liberalism is virtually the absolute opposite of contemporary conservatism. And the things that conservatives apparently would like to see more government control over, again, I mentioned a couple of them: pornography, illicit drugs, and so on. Liberals are just the opposite on these views. And whereas conservatives want more, local control over, for instance, education policies, well, liberals want more control over those issues. So it's almost like they divided up all the great issues of our day, and you take this one, and I'll take this one, and so on, and they're virtually opposites in that regard. Now, in terms of government control, socialism even goes further in that respect, in terms of wanting to control so many aspects of life that in the past we believe freedom should prevail in those areas. Now, if you move further up the scale, let's say to Philadelphia, we have fascism. What would be next? New York City, we have Nazism. And Boston, Marxism, communism. Again, if you were to overlay a map of the United States on all of this. And so those are just degrees of authoritarianism or totalitarianism. And so I think that's something that's a whole lot clearer and more accurate than the standard linear model that is used in virtually all political science courses and writings and so on. So I developed this one at the bottom, this two-dimensional model, when I taught political science. And I realized how flawed the standard model was. It really distorts reality terribly. So let me just pause briefly here, and any comments or questions you might have about that political orientations 2 models. Yes, Dan?
Well, I came in typically late, so you may have already covered this, but the old model, doesn't that come from like the French house of whatever it was, the Burgesses or whatever, when they were leading up to the French Revolution, the people that sat on the right were the monarchists. They want the king and the ancient regime, and the other people wanted the revolution. And neither of those corresponds to, say, the United States.
No, not at all. That actually was part of the French Revolution and the aftermath of the revolution. You're right, where the conservatives, not to be confused with the kind of people that we refer to as conservatives today, but the monarchists, as you said, and those who wanted a state church, the Roman Catholic Church and that sort of thing, they all sat on the right side of the assembly. The left-wing socialist revolutionaries sat on the left side, and so that was.
Gives you no place for ordered liberty. There's no place for George Washington.
No, apparently
no place for John Law.
Apparently, there was no center section. Right. That it was one or the other, and both were just horribly dysfunctional. Yeah. Thanks. Yes, please.
If you take the model up there, which is linear, I would make the suggestion that you actually turn it into a circle. whereby communism is at 11:59 a.m. and fascism is at 12:01. And therefore you actually have a degree of closeness in their shared value.
Yeah, that's been proposed. But they really belong in the same quadrant, don't they? As down here on the revised two-dimensional model, they're not extremes. No, they're very similar. Again, what distinguishes Nazism from communism, in general, was that Nazism, of course, was not only totalitarian, it was racist, overtly racist. But
I'm not sure communism and that model disagree, because you can take the bourgeoisie and replace it with the German race, and then you make the proletariat one versus the Jews, or vice versa. So
yeah, that's a good point you make. And the bourgeoisie, the what we would call the kind of upper middle class, was regarded as the great enemy of the people, the commoners. Yeah, good point. Any other thoughts on that model, Paul?
Question. I'm looking at the two-dimensional model.
Yeah.
And I know Dennis Prager on the comments about what he calls the left versus liberalism, modern liberalism.
Yeah.
I mean, you make that distinction. He says modern liberals, which probably are a dying breed, seems like hard to find, or by his definition, they believe in truth. He doesn't agree with their politics, but they agree. You can talk to them about truth, whereas the left denies.
Yes, I've heard him say that multiple times, this Dennis Prager, and I think he probably gives liberals a bit too much credit, frankly. He does rightly point out, however, that when controversial critical issues come to the forefront, liberals almost always capitulate with the left, with the far left, the socialist left, and all. I think he's still thinking of, quote, liberals as being sort of JFK type of Democrats, or FDR type of Democrats.
Of course, he always says the left ruins everything.
Yes, the left destroys everything, and the evidence strongly supports that view. They are corrupting everything in America, the morals and the political structure, everything else. Yeah, he's a very astute political observer, isn't he? Dan?
I'll make it fast. To Paul's point, I was raised kind of in a left-wing household, so I have some, front row seats for some of this stuff. And my mother is gone now. I don't want to speak ill of the dead, and she's revered in our.
And yet you're relatively normal.
Well, there was a conversion along the way, but quickly, I would just say that the liberalism of my household always would collapse into leftism whenever certain things were pushed or whatever. And speaking of Dennis Prager, it's true that he does distinguish these, and there's a great article, liberalism is not leftism, and you can find that at the Investor's Business Daily, Google for it. But and he gives examples like a colorblind society is an ideal that's been abandoned. So Dr. King is the next person to get past some of the sentimentality probably that keeps him around as an influence. But quickly, I would just say that in practical terms, the leftism that Dennis Prager is talking about pretty much collapses into the socialism on your scale. And yes, he is thinking of pre-1968. There were so many things happening. It wasn't just Paris. You had the Weatherman bombings. You had the campus riots on the West Coast, the Watts riots in Los Angeles in 64, 65.
65.
Everything came off the wheels, in that period. And so I would argue that what Dennis Prager is thinking of is indeed a pre-68 liberalism. And so the left is the post-68 liberalism. And I would even argue to Dennis, whom I've met, that that liberals are scarce, is that he only quotes from two. He's down to Alan Dershowitz and Steven Pinker. That's the only two I've ever heard him mention on the show that were still surviving contemporary liberals who still believed in, free. Now there is this new strain of people like Douglas Murray, people like Andrew Doyle, people like obviously Peterson, who are not traditional conservatives, but nonetheless do revere the liberal tradition, meaning freedom of speech and all that sort of thing. Now, Douglas Murray is more complicated because he's backtracked on some of that. And he now wants us to endorse his same-sex marriage and things like that we may not be able to endorse anyway.
Yeah, and to follow it through historically, by 1972, the Democratic Party is no longer the party of JFK and FDR. It's lurched to the left considerably by 1972. And of course, the trend has just continued since then.
Well, there was actually, I know I'm taking up all the time, but there was actually something called the McGovern Commission, where George McGovern, after the riots and all the unpleasantness of the Democratic Convention in '68, he actually spearheaded this effort to rewrite all the party rules for that particular party to bias everything against the Northern ethnic Catholics who were pro-life and replace that whole demographic with angry young people. The student rebellion people were slotted in to replace the Archie Bunkers, and the Archie Bunkers, the hard hats, the union dock workers. Those people were crowded out in terms of influence on policy, and that's how you got, surprise, a McGovern candidacy.
Right.
4 years later.
Right.
So I'll shut up now.
Yeah, and it's just continued again, drifting further and further to the left. All right, now let's take a look at some. Oh, please, one more comment here, and then we'll move on.
Maybe the rhinos are the new pre-68 liberalism. They love free speech, but they don't love the other conservative values.
Well, what's called rhinos by other conservative Republicans, they oftentimes capitulate, don't they, to the liberals or the leftists? Yeah, and they like to call themselves moderates, but I would call them basically political pacifists, in that they will not stand and fight, will they, for certain principles, which means that ultimately they aid the left, intentionally or not. They do, because they will not fight. And think back through history at all the wars that have been won by pacifists. Well, actually, there aren't any, are there? Say, and so it's not that every war is right versus wrong, good and evil, not at all, but some have been good versus evil, generally speaking. And pacifism, of course, never will fight for what is right and good. All right, let's move on here, and some applicable biblical principles. Now, we understand that the New Testament is written in a time when you've got an authoritarian, at times virtually totalitarian, Roman government that is totally amoral, if not explicitly immoral, and it in some respects wants to control many aspects of people's lives. So the early Christians, they're not living in a society and culture like ours. Ours, of course, we're so fortunate. We frankly are the most privileged, also the most prosperous Christians who have ever lived. But the early church, of course, had to function in the midst of a pagan society, an amoral pagan society, in which the concept of justice was oftentimes thrown out, but it was rarely ever followed through. So, given the realities of human nature, we understand that government is a necessary institution. We need laws and rules. Now, we have been created in the imago Dei, in the image of God, and we have been endowed by God with a rational mind, if we'll use it, also with a moral conscience. We know innately that certain things are right and wrong. And also, we are endowed with the capacity for creativity. In addition, we're not only conscious beings, but we're also conscious of being conscious beings, which sets us apart from all the other, living creatures on Earth. But we also have a self-centered or a sinful nature and an orientation that is, rather than being God-centered or theocentric, we have a nature that is ego-centered, very self-centered. And so we, unless we have submitted otherwise and practice Christian ethics, we tend to exploit situations, and we tend to use other people and things to satisfy our own selfish desires. Now, those are the realities. So let's look at, for instance, the purpose of government. And this is the purpose of government as set forth in our founding documents. Again, America's founders were not all Christian, to say the least, but they were influenced by biblical principles and by Christian standards. Even the ones who were certainly not actually Christians, the deists and all, like Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin, Ethan Allen, people like that. But they understood that the purpose of government exists in order to enact just laws that are justifiable. In other words, good laws. And not only to enact just laws, but also to enforce just laws for the good of all citizens. So they understood that, and I think they were absolutely on target as a result. Now, good government protects its citizens' safety. It protects our security and our property from domestic criminals and from foreign invaders. And every nation has also included the idea that a government needs to protect the integrity of its own national borders. The fact that ours are totally out of control is just a real anomaly in human history. Even the worst governments, nations you can possibly imagine, understood you cannot have a functioning nation with open borders. And so that, of course, is a major consideration in the upcoming election here. Now, they also understood that a good government does not try to control the details of their citizens' lives. A good government respects citizens' privacy and also basic civil liberties. A good government does not try to be, quote, nice by helping some citizens at the expense of other citizens through confiscatory taxation and the redistribution of wealth. A good government understands that, yes, taxation is necessary in order to support the fundamental institutions of government, but to take money by force from some citizens and distribute it to other citizens according to the preferences of government officials is quite unjust. So a good government is not created in order to be nice. It's created in order to enact and enforce just laws. And that's something that I think has been lost, terribly lost over the last several decades. Such a policy where you have a government that tries to equalize social standards and wealth and so on, in other words, enforce equity, as they call it today, oftentimes rewards those who are totally irresponsible. And in exchange, of course, they get the votes of those people. So some basic principles related to the purpose of government. Now, the principle of equal justice under the law, regardless of one's social and economic status is another principle that America's founders understood. Equal justice for both rich and powerful, as well as for those who are poor and vulnerable. We even read this principle in the Old Testament, in the Mosaic Law, Leviticus 19:15, which reads, quote, "Do not pervert justice. Do not show partiality. Don't show partiality to the poor or favoritism to the rich, but judge your neighbor fairly." So in other words, don't discriminate in favor of poor people. Don't discriminate in favor of rich, powerful people, which of course has usually been the case throughout history. But both are prohibited in Old Testament law, and I think that's just a basic fundamental moral principle of government. When federal judges take the oath of office, they swear, quote, "I will administer justice without respect to persons." In other words, the social economic status of persons. "And I will do equal justice to the poor and to the rich." A federal court judge has put it this way: "Truth and rightness do not depend on race or color or nationality or sex or religion or net worth or power." Okay, so equal justice under the law. Now, in terms of political philosophy, again, what does the New Testament seem to imply? Are there any principles there that, even though it was written in a society and culture drastically different from ours, nonetheless, there are some basic principles that are still applicable? I think absolutely that's the case. Early Christians, as I said, were living under very ruthless, amoral pagan regimes in which oftentimes there was very little justice. While the government could not and should not force compliance with higher biblical principles, it should nonetheless promote and enforce principles based on natural moral law. Again, the whole foundation, you might say, the lowest common denominator in terms of what we can expect of all citizens in a society. Christians should obey the governing authorities, provided it doesn't violate the higher moral laws of God. And these are familiar passages, I'm sure, to all of you. Romans 13, verses 1-7, where we're told that everyone should submit to their governing authorities and pay their taxes. 1 Peter 2, 13-17 also talks about submission to governing authorities. Peter writes, quote, "Live as free men, but do not use your freedom as a cover-up for evil." Again, oftentimes that's the fallacy in libertarianism. Live as servants of God. Show proper respect for everyone, including governing authorities. That can be extremely challenging, can't it? Okay. However, governing authorities should serve as agents of justice. Their power is not absolute, and they need to understand that. They should not abuse their power, or they will be judged by God. Acts 4:19 states, "But Peter and John reply when they're dragged before the Sanhedrin, 'Judge for yourselves whether it's right in God's sight to obey you rather than God.'" So in other words, our allegiance should have absolute definite limitations, okay? And we cannot, as Christians, violate our God-given conscience in any respect, regardless of what the government demands. Acts 5:29, similarly, Peter and the other apostles replied, "We must obey God rather than men." So I think this is obviously a biblical principle that, was applicable back in their day, and it's equally applicable to our time as well. Now, citizens are entitled to basic civil liberties. And this is the case so that we can live open lives in keeping with Christian values. In other words, as America's founding fathers, I think, understood, they wanted to maximize freedom, but also emphasize virtue. And there's all these quotes you can find from John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, many of the other founding fathers, where they link virtue and freedom. And once virtue begins to decline in a society and culture, then freedom will turn into, and liberty will turn into libertarianism, basically. In the book of Acts, Paul asserts his rights as a Roman citizen when he's treated unjustly by Roman authorities. Acts 16, verses 16 to 40, tells us about Paul and Silas are being unjustly arrested and jailed in Philippi. They were arrested for exorcising a demon that possessed a slave girl. And when released the following morning, Paul tells the officials, quote, "They," meaning the city officials, "beat us publicly without trial, even though we are Roman citizens, and they threw us into prison. And now, do they want to get rid of us quietly? No, let them come themselves and escort us out of town." So he's making the case that he and Silas have been unjustly treated, and that the officials need an apology from the officials. Similarly, in Acts 22, we read Paul's arrested in Jerusalem for provoking a riot on the false charges of perverting the Jewish religion and bringing, quote, Greeks into the temple area and defiling this holy place. Now, when he's arrested by a Roman commander and after testifying to the mob, Paul's taken in chains to the local barracks and he's stretched out to be flogged, when he turns and asks the centurion who's supervising all of this, "Is it really legal for you to flog a Roman citizen who hasn't even been found guilty?" Well, the centurion is very startled, and he goes to the commander and he reports that Paul claims to be a Roman citizen. So the commander comes in, and after questioning Paul, he orders him released. And we read, quote, "Those who were about to question him withdrew immediately. The commander himself was alarmed when he realized that he had put Paul, a Roman citizen, in chains, which was against Roman law." And so here's Paul once again standing up for his citizenship rights. Acts 25, we read about how after realizing that he'll not be accorded a fair trial in Israel under the governor at the time, Festus, or the Jewish king at the time, Agrippa, Paul exercises his rights as a Roman citizen, and he appeals his case to Caesar in Rome. He realizes he's not going to get any justice there in Jerusalem, and so he, as a Roman citizen, has the right to appeal to Caesar. And so they have to relent. Now, unfortunately, who's Caesar at the time? Nero. Okay, one of the absolute most insane berserk government leaders, in all of history. But actually, historically, this was before Nero went totally, absolutely insane. And so Paul is saying he thinks he'd get a more just decision from Caesar. But in retrospect, of course, we realize how awful Nero Caesar was. But apparently, Paul, the book of Acts ends with Paul traveling to Rome. And then for 2 years, he's basically under house arrest, awaiting an audience with Caesar. Well, the historical sources are not totally clear, but apparently he was absolved of any problems under Nero, to the extent that we have some historical sources that report that Paul actually was able to continue his ministry for a couple of more years, but apparently he returns back to Rome, and it's on that second return to Rome that he's finally convicted and executed. Okay. So anyway, some basic principles from Scripture that I think is very, very helpful to keep in mind. And again, America's founders were certainly acquainted with political philosophy all the way back to ancient Athenian democracy. They were acquainted with the Bible, and they were influenced by Christian values. And we're so very, very fortunate as a result. But so much of that has been discarded, as we know, over the last century. And we're certainly suffering the consequences. Let me pause here before we transition to the PowerPoint presentation for the rest of our session. And again, any comments or questions that come to mind? And yeah, any of you who are joining us online, any comments, questions come to mind that we can address? Okay, and Paul, I'm going to try to transition here to, but I didn't call it up previously. Just a moment here as we make the transition to PowerPoint.
Do like you always do.
So I just need to get back to there.
However you load it.
So we're Dropbox, we're going to go to PowerPoint. There's that. These are both old ones.
Mm-hmm.
Just a moment here and we'll be ready to go.
Okay, go back to your share. You do.
What now?
If not, I can hit share.
Oops. Share screen there. Yeah. Minimize that.
There you go.
And I have to go to slideshow. Why is it not full screen? Oh, from the beginning. All right. Thanks, Paul. All right. So here we have C.S. Lewis on politics and the good society based on the book I wrote a couple of years ago. And Paul, how do I get off this strip here?
I don't know. I don't know.
Do we drag it up?
I think it'll disappear in a minute.
If it disappears, that will start.
Does it? Okay.
Try clicking a slide.
All right.
There is a chat up there, just by the way.
Okay. Comment for the chat.
Oh, there.
This comes from Pat Quigley. Pat writes, it's interesting how the example of Paul in Old Testament, I guess New Testament, is continually expressing political opinion in an authoritarian environment. And many evangelical pastors today, in an environment of we the people, are scared to share any political opinions. Oh, you got several amens and acknowledgments, Pat. And the last book that we'll talk about in our course will be a new one from Eric Metaxas called Letter to the American Church. And Pat, I don't know of another book that is more effective in addressing that problem. And it is a major problem in our churches, our evangelical churches. And it needs to be confronted. Because we're to stand for what's right and true and good in every aspect. And just because these issues are controversial is no excuse for not addressing them. So I understand that a lot of pastors are afraid that these kind of issues are divisive and might even cause some people to check out of the church. But again, I think Metaxas does an excellent job critiquing that mentality. Yes, this, you're, yes.
Said that usually at all the politics, they're using that as your only source to try to get cultural change.
Mhm.
That's a futile exercise.
Yes.
I think we should be involved, but the church still the main driver. So I think sometimes we start pulling through because we volunteer, we should vote and all that, but at the end of the day, it's still our way to do it. Our fellow man.
Yeah, we understand it's a part of comprehensive Christian discipleship, but you're quite right. How we address these issues can make all the difference. And that's why Jesus said, to share the truth, but in love. Okay. So how we do it makes oftentimes all the difference. Very well said. Okay, all right. Oh, okay. So that's Paul. Okay. All right. So C.S. Lewis on Politics and the Good Society. And again, I hope you have the book. It's not very long. It's only about 70 pages, but there's an awful lot in there. And again, especially for those of you who are avid C.S. Lewis aficionados, I think you'll find this to be very stimulating reading and very informative. So the contents here in the book and in my presentation, we'll do an introduction, and then we'll talk about C.S. Lewis on natural law, the political philosophy of C.S. Lewis, which a lot of people don't even realize he had one, and then ruminations on the good society, and we'll finish with a summa. So here's the preface. All right, now, what is this? Space, a galaxy out there somewhere? Any other?
Oh, it's North Korea and South Korea.
Does that help?
Yeah.
Okay, so let's go back a slide. You see a difference there between these two countries? And a lot of this difference, the fact that North Korea is blacked out, has a lot to do with the horrible government that they have had for what, now 75 years. And in contrast to their Korean neighbors to the south, a very progressive nation, actually, progressive in the true sense of the word. And the point here is that politics does matter. It matters a lot in terms of quality of life. And we'll go on and unpack that as we go further into the book. Now, Lewis is well known. Perhaps you've seen this. People that don't want to get Christianity mixed in with politics, will oftentimes cite Lewis here. Government is at best a necessary evil. Well, that's absolutely true, because we know that government has a tendency to become absolutely tyrannical and unjust. It's also necessary, though. And so when you kind of unpack what Lewis is saying there, I mean, there's nothing fallacious about it. I like this quote. It's probably familiar to you from James Madison. If men were angels, no government would be necessary. Again, libertarians seem to think that the first part of that is true. Men are angels, at least potentially. But, the Bible and history evidence otherwise. A Pharisee asked Jesus, Rabbi, which is the greatest commandment? And Jesus replies, love the Lord God with all your heart, all your soul, all your mind and strength. And the second is like it, love others as you love yourself. So the question, and I've raised this before, the question is this, basically, how can we truly love others if we don't really care, if we're indifferent toward the kind of laws and public policies and programs that regulate and oftentimes control their lives? How could you say that you truly love somebody if they're living in a very repressive system? How can we possibly love others unless we're sensitive to and attentive to not only their religious and spiritual lives, and that would be in keeping with what the Great Commission, but also their physical, their material, their emotional, their social, their intellectual and creative needs as well. And those of us who have raised children know that we always strove to do just that. We understood that what was most important was the development of their character, their spiritual lives, their relationship with God through faith in Jesus Christ. But it didn't end there, did it? We loved them. And so we wanted to be very attentive to their physical needs, their material needs, emotional, social, intellectual, and creative needs as well. So if we have that kind of an attitude toward our children, as we should, I mean, we should likewise have that attitude toward everyone, if we truly love others as we're commanded to do. So again, the answer to the question, how can we truly love others if we're indifferent? And the answer is, of course, we can't love them properly. Why did such a brilliant Christian thinker such as C.S. Lewis, who wrote so extensively and perceptively on so many things that matter, he wrote on philosophy, on morality, theology, the Bible, psychology, or those 2 chapters in Mere Christianity that he wrote about psychology are just absolutely brilliant. Sociology, human relations, anthropology, science, and the arts have so little interest in politics and government. In other words, how could somebody who was so brilliant a thinker have had so little interest in politics and government? And the answer is, he didn't. He was interested in politics and government because he understood that part of our charge to love others has a political component to it. So here we are, C.S. Lewis, foremost Christian thinker and writer of the 20th century. I honestly can't think of anybody else who shines brighter in that respect as a great Christian thinker and writer in the 20th century than C.S. Lewis. Not even Joel Osteen. I could name several others too, but all right. So what we find in C.S. Lewis here is a scholar, a philosopher, an apologist, in other words, somebody who defends the integrity and the truthfulness of the Christian faith. He writes on theology. He's a literary critic, in fact, one of the greatest in the world at the time. Science fiction writer, as you know, is Chronicles of Narnia and Space Trilogy and so on. He's a poet and an author of children's fantasy novels. His books have sold over 275 million copies. And in a Christianity Today poll, back when Christianity Today still had a measure of credibility, in the year 2000. Um, of the most influential Christian books of the 20th century, Mere Christianity was number one, and I'd say rightly so. Chronicles of Narnia number two, and the Screwtape Letters number three. So the top three influential Christian books of the 20th century. Now, I would consider him to be one of the 20 most significant and influential Christians in all of Christian history, actually. He's a fierce critic of secular humanism, godless ideology. He's a fierce critic of moral relativism, this idea that there is no absolute right and wrong, and the destructive effects of moral relativism on the spiritual and moral culture in Great Britain and the West in general. Lewis's writings were deliberately at variance with modern trends and fads. This point cannot be overemphasized. He had absolutely no interest in the latest fads and trends, unlike so many are caught up in. All he cared about was truth and traditional truths that we can trace back to Scripture itself. And so is he trying to temper his views and all so as to maybe cultivate a wider audience? Well, no, he just simply speaks, these eternal truths. And whether they're popular right now or not, he couldn't care less. So they're deliberately at variance with modern trends and fads. His primary focus is, like all great philosophers all the way back to Socrates and Plato, and that is, what is true? That's what matters. What's good? But now, as we know, a lot that is true is not good. So we need to differentiate the two. But he emphasizes what's true, what's good, and also what's beautiful. So the aesthetic blessings of life, he wants us to appreciate and cultivate, a sense of appreciation for that as well. When you look at Christian apologetics, which over the last 30 years especially has really expanded in terms of its influence and all, Christian apologetics focuses almost exclusively on what's true, doesn't it? And to some extent on ethics and morality, in other words, what's good, but not nearly enough as it should on the beautiful aspects of life. And that takes us back to that section in the introductory outline that I said for time's sake, it's going to skip over, but I'll send out some thoughts on the beautiful and how that should be something that's a priority for Christians. And this applies not only for visual arts, but for music and, every other area of art in life. He was, in fact, the prototypical everyman of the 20th century. He starts out in a very nominally Christian family, growing up in a nominally Christian family. And by the time he's about 14, he's decided that actually this is all nonsense. There is no God. There's no evidence for a God. And so as a teenager, he's a very, very proud skeptic, a very proud atheist skeptic. But he has a hard time correlating skeptical atheism with, again, anything that's lofty and uplifting about the world or about our human nature. And so he transitions in his late teens from atheistic skepticism to what we might call romantic idealism. In other words, he'd like to believe that there's, well, where does our sense of beauty come from, for one thing? I mean, when we look at nature and the beauty of nature, I mean, it's just stuff, it's just molecules. And why should we think it's beautiful or attractive and other stuff is just the opposite? there's no basis for making that delineation, but everyone does. And so he begins to appreciate at least the romantic ideal, and that is that there are certain things that elevate our soul in this world. Now, atheists can't begin to explain why that's the case, but Christianity does. Christianity offers reasons, valid reasons, why there's certain things that we all acknowledge, unless we've been on, been tripping on LSD too long. There's certain things in this life that we all understand, oh, this is really beautiful and uplifting, and it really enriches life. But then he goes from romantic idealism to is there a supernatural component in life? And he comes to the realization, yes, there is, but he comes to a belief in the supernatural through the occult, through seeing obvious evil being expressed in life. And that's why I call it theosophical occultism. And yet there's a reality that transcends just the physical and material in life. Now, from that, he comes to a realization that, well, yeah, there are supernatural evil forces, but there's also apparently supernatural forces for good. And so he transitions from occultism to pantheism. From pantheism, though, he transitions to Manichaeism. And Manichaeism is this idea that there are two equal and opposite spiritual forces in the universe. One is evil, the other is good. And so, but they're co-equal. And why are they co-equal? Well, because sometimes the good seems to triumph. Oftentimes evil, though, triumphs. And so that's a Manichaeist view. But from Manichaeism, he finally comes to the realization that there is a God who comports with the God of the Bible. In other words, kind of a generic theistic point of view. And that Manichaeism really, if you try to analyze it, it becomes totally unsupportable. So there must be some transcendent spiritual force in the universe, and we need to be attentive to that and align ourselves accordingly with it. Now, from generic theism, though, eventually, when he's 33 years old, he embraces Christianity. And so the prototypical everyman of the 20th century, look at the stages he goes through. And what a testimony to someone who, even rather half-heartedly, wants to comport his life with reality. If you follow that inclination through to its logical conclusion, this is where you end up, and that is with Christianity and belief in the historical Jesus Christ as presented in the Bible. So, very interesting. Now, he likes to describe himself as merely a mere Christian. He's really not caught up in all these ecclesiastical and some of the theological debates and conflicts that have divided Christians over the last 2,000 years. So he understands that there's some basic premises by which a person has to acknowledge in order to qualify as a Christian. And the Bible's quite clear about that. We have to believe that Jesus Christ was divine. We have to believe in the reality of the Trinity. We have to believe that that mankind, although born in the image of God, we also have a sinful nature that needs to be atoned for, and Jesus Christ did just that. So he believes that all true Christians hold to the premise that we are saved from our sins by the atoning work of Jesus Christ, and that we are saved, spiritually saved, essentially through faith in Jesus Christ by the grace of God. Now, beyond that, Christians again fragment and divide all up, everything from Baptist to Catholic, and from Mennonite to Orthodox Christianity, Eastern Orthodox Christianity. So he wants to focus on the essentials of the Christian faith. Now, there's certainly a place for being more specific and all. And it's not that these other issues, oftentimes that divide up denomination, it's not that they're necessarily unimportant, but they're certainly not most important. And that's what he's devoted to, is expressing what's most important. So the doctrine of the Trinity, the deity of Christ, the atoning work of Jesus Christ, the incarnation, the physical bodily resurrection, and the doctrinal and moral authority of Scripture as well. Now, he's a man of great character, and those who knew him well, at least those who seem to have had a strong moral and spiritual sense about them, would oftentimes refer to Lewis as at least one of the greatest men they've ever known. Not only are they so impressed by his intellect, but also by the character and the way he lives his life. Walter Hooper, who later became a custodian of much of C.S. Lewis's legacy, put it this way: Lewis was, quote, the most thoroughly converted man I ever met, whose whole vision of life was such that the natural and supernatural seemed inseparably combined. So by being the most thoroughly converted man, of course, he's talking about every aspect of Lewis's life, how he lived his life, seemed to be, under the lordship of Jesus Christ, at least according to Walter Hooper. An Oxford colleague says Lewis was the best read man any of us is ever likely to meet. Another Oxford colleague wrote that Lewis was perhaps the most brilliant man in the world. Douglas Gresham, one of Lewis's stepsons, said years later, after Lewis died, Lewis was the finest man and the best Christian I've ever known. Now, this is somebody who grew up in Lewis's household, at least I think by the time he was about 10 or 12, he became Lewis's adopted stepson. And boy, this is really something to consider, isn't it? Would your children ever say that about you? That you were the finest person and the best Christian they've ever known? Wow. That requires some serious thought, doesn't it? I would refer to Lewis as a 20th century sage. Like, for instance, these three. Who do we have here? I'm sorry. Oh, Solzhenitsyn on the right. Okay, who's in the center? Bonhoeffer. And over on the left, G.K. Chesterton. Yeah, what? I'm sorry, what'd you? Oh, no, we'll leave him out, okay?
I see his name.
So Chesterton, Bonhoeffer, Solzhenitsyn. Do these men qualify as 20th century sages? Yeah, in some respects, certainly. In some regards, they were, each one was very, very outstanding. How about these two? Who's the one on the left? William F. Buckley Jr. Oh, yes, very, very well stated. And the one on the right?
Muggeridge, maybe?
Yeah, that's Malcolm Muggeridge. Let's see if we got the answers. Yeah, we did. Okay. Who's on the left over here? Francis Schaeffer. And on the right?
Richard John Newhouse.
Richard John Newhouse. Okay. 20th century sages. Wise people. On the left,
Robbie George.
that's Robert George, Princeton University legal scholar, very, very wise man, one of the great ones today.
Chuck Holt,
And on, pardon me,
friend of Chuck Holt.
and friend of Chuck Colson. And the one on the right, John Lennox. Very good. Okay. And of course, we can't forget Robert Keeshan. Everybody knows who this is, correct? Okay. Well, actually, my apologies. Actually, he does not belong on this
Couldn't you
list.
at least give us Mr. Rogers, and he was a sage. Captain Kangaroo, I don't know.
I think we'll pass. I think we'll pass. I think we'll pass. All right. So what we have here in C.S. Lewis, Lewis was not a professional philosopher, although he actually did teach philosophy occasionally at Oxford University, but he was not a PhD in philosophy or anything like that in traditional philosophy. He's not a professional theologian. He's not a professional Bible scholar. He's not a professional historian or a psychologist or a professional social scientist. Nonetheless, he thinks and he writes very perceptively in all of these areas. And anything that he writes in those areas is to be taken quite seriously. I mean, he wasn't infallible, obviously, but he really is one of the great thinkers of the 20th century. Now, Lewis never wrote a book on political philosophy, but he integrated his ideas on political philosophy into several books and articles, and those are what I cite in my book on Lewis. So let's, in the time we have remaining here, which is hardly any time at all. I just noticed the clock here. So let me stop at this point and we'll begin here next week. But let me go back and check with you all and any comments, questions you might have. We have only 4 or 5 minutes, but anything that could use some clarification, any observations you might have. Those of you online or those in the classroom here. Yes, please.
One quick comment. What do you think his political influence was by actually literally teaching BBC during the war? I mean, he was.
Political influence in particular?
I think he actually he sustained the culture of Britain during the war.
Yeah, he certainly made contributions to this war, which again is, best case scenario in any war in human history is one side is mostly better than the other side. That's as good as it gets. No nation is ideal or anything like that. But there was a very definite stark contrast between British society and culture and the British rule of law and that of the Germans and the Italians and Japanese, of course. And no, I think he contributed very admirably to the war effort.
And it became your Christianity.
Yes, yeah, those radio broadcasts actually become his book, Mere Christianity.
So for somebody who doesn't write about political philosophy, he had quite the political effect.
Yeah, he did. he was not a political philosopher, but he had quite a political effect, as you say, because he's standing up for what's good and true and beautiful, in contrast to some of the greatest evil the world's ever experienced. Good point. And so you'd have Lewis going on the radio on the BBC once a week, and apparently the audience was very large, hundreds of thousands of people, maybe even more than that, throughout Britain. Many of them are sitting there in their local pub, and they're listening to these brilliant theological insights and moral insights from Lewis. So few Sunday mornings ago, before we got ready to come here for church, Dolly was, no, we were not sitting in a pub at the time. That wasn't the point I was going to make. But
It's always time for a Guinness.
Dolly was going through the TV stations trying to find something inspirational, and nothing emerged. And as I think most all of us know, 20 or 30 years ago, there would have been, several church services and all, but those seemingly are gone with the wind. Okay. So, well, any other comments, questions? Yes, Paul and Millie, and then we'll go to Dan, and we'll finish up real quick here.
The war in Britain, that had a psychological component that Americans did not experience.
The war in Britain had a psychological component that.
And so this would have been very uplifting for them. It was extremely dark time.
Yes, and they were on the verge of being annihilated. And the very idea that Hitler never launched a major invasion of Great Britain, still in retrospect, is just frankly phenomenal. I mean, you all know from is it Calais to the White Cliffs of Dover's, 30 miles across the English Channel, and the very idea that the Germans never launched an invasion on England, I believe that's only attributable to divine intervention, divine oversight.
I was just going to say,
and Dan,
if anyone in the room is unfamiliar with the wonderful C.S. Lewis doodles on YouTube, they are animated drawings. Somebody's writing on a chalkboard and illustrating Lewis's words as they're spoken. Now they have an English narrator. He's not the narrator, but they did get an English narrator, and they do just gorgeous artwork and gorgeous historical research. So like the opening of Mere Christianity, it starts out with the air raid sirens, and then it's all clear, and then you're sitting at the bedside, you're listening to, and they actually reproduced in this, just in a chalk drawing, they reproduced this classic 1930s radio and a 1930s alarm clock, and you're just sitting at your bedside listening to this voice. Well, the other fun thing is that if you listen to C.S. Lewis's Four Loves on C.S. Lewis Doodles, that is actually Lewis's voice. He actually recorded that, so you can actually hear Lewis himself reading that. But you just go on YouTube and just hit it up for C.S. Lewis Doodles. Unfortunately, some of their best work has subsequently left YouTube. I think there was a copyright conflict, or maybe it's just in certain countries and not others.
Okay.
So, but yeah, some of his best work, like Polarism, and I think the other one on the subjectivism, the heresy of subjectivism, something. Yeah, some work, something like that. Anyway.
Okay. Yeah, a lot online.
Oh yeah, this is all on YouTube. C.S. Lewis Doodles, don't miss it.
Well, we will pick up exactly at this point where we left off this evening. And again, if this is of particular interest to you, you can get the book on Amazon. Now, I think we have a few copies we brought if anybody in the classroom here would like a copy of the book. But I think you'll find, even though it's pretty brief, there's just an awful lot of content in it. So I'm very much looking forward to going through that with you all next week. So thanks. Good being with you. Blessings on the rest of your week. Those of you who join us online, always wonderful to see you as well. So we'll continue next week. Thanks.